Good morning. I'm Bruce Klingner. I'm Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. I've been here about 11 years, and before that, 20 years with the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a beautiful day out there. I just flew in from Beijing last night where it was very hot and humid, so this is actually quite a nice change. So I'm hopefully not going to get hit by jet lag while I'm up here on the dais. In Beijing, we got quite an earful. We had an American delegation. We heard a lot about the trade war between, or the trade reconnaissance by fire or skirmish, whatever we want to call it. That was a big topic of conversation, as it has been in Washington. And then also North Korea was actually the main focus of the group's discussion. And that, again, reflects what we have in Washington. So those two topics really have crowded out most other Asian issues from the focus in Washington. So what we want to do today is talk about Japan and the U.S.-Japan relationship and the alliance, which I think has, unfortunately been overshadowed by, the hot issues. And we oftentimes neglect our friends, we neglect our allies, and we neglect the importance of long-term strategy in Northeast Asia as well as the Indo-Pacific region. And we often are drawn like moths to the flames of the hot issues or the problems. So what we want to do is focus more on the relationship which either is out of the news and is being quietly effective, or are there concerns, particularly in Japan, that it's being neglected. So when we had the title of Japan, America's Neglected Ally, we had the question mark at the end because we may discover today that it's not neglected, it's just out of the news. So joining me today really is an amazingly distinguished panel to discuss all of these issues. Dr. Kent Calder is the distinguished Edward Rushauer Professor. He's director of the Japan Studies Program at the Nitze School at SAIS, as well as director of the Rushauer Center for East Asia Studies. And I believe you may have a new title that?
Vice Dean.
Vice Dean, all right. So yet another title to add to his list. He also served as special advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to Japan under Ambassadors Walter Mondale and Tom Foley. He was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Rays with neck ribbon by the Japanese government for his contributions to the development of Japan studies in the United States and the enhancement of mutual understanding between the two countries. Also the recipient of the Ohira, Urasawa, and Manichi Asia-Pacific Prizes for his academic work, and the list goes on. Dr. Sheila Smith is a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, is the author of numerous books, including Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics, and A Rising China, as well as Japan's New Politics and the U.S.-Japan Alliance. Her current focus is on how geostrategic change in Asia is shaping Japan's strategic choices. She also serves as the vice chair of the U.S. advisors to the U.S.-Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Exchange. And a special treat, visitor from Japan, Sunio Watanabe, or Nabe, is a senior research fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, an independent policy research organization, Tokyo, and is also a adjunct fellow with the Japan Chair at CSIS here in Washington, and a senior research fellow at the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation. He previously served as a senior fellow and director of foreign and security policy at the Tokyo Foundation, and then the Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute in Tokyo. So it really is a blue ribbon panel we have to discuss these issues. And we're going to have Nabe go first, serve as a mini keynote speaker, because many folks in Tokyo have not, at least outside of the Japan Watchers crowd, may not have heard him. So he is going to give us the view from Tokyo on many issues, and then the others will not only be commentators, but more panelists presenting their own views. So Nabe-san,
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciated your introduction. One correction, actually, I don't have a title for the Japan initiative for the Japan's reconstruction. That's the founder of Funabashi Yoichi, my mentor and a good friend, but no formal position. Maybe that's one correction. And
maybe after today you will.
You know, I'm very happy to be back in Washington, D.C. I keep coming back to Washington, D.C. since my 10 years at the CSI is 95 to the 2005. Well, you know, people don't see often each other. So some people still believe I still living in Washington, D.C. I keep coming back to Washington, D.C. Maybe already this time, 3 times, the third times I came back to the Washington, D.C. this year. So I may come back November. So that's my second hometown. And also appreciate the Heritage Foundation. That's always give opportunity to discuss the policy issues, especially the blues. Actually, this time, I tried to contact the blues. What's going on in U.S. policy toward North Korea? So please share your insights, what's going on. So, but instead, Bruce said, oh, let's do some conference. And oh, why not? That's more insights from floor too. And I appreciated my old friend and the mentor, actually, the Dr. Karada, because I used to work at the CSIS when Dr. Karada was a Japan chair. And also, Sheila was actually affiliated with CSIS Pacific Forum when I was working at the CSIS, right? No? Not really. Okay. That's my memory is so bad. So let me start with the very good title, Japan, America's neglected ally. Yep. It's neglected? Maybe not, but somehow isolated in North Korean policy. Maybe, but maybe not. That's very, very interesting things ongoing. But one clear thing is Japan is not neglected because Japan is a very important trade partner, and as you may realize, now our economic minister Motegi is a bilateral talk with the USTR Lighthizer. So that's very hot issue. So you know, the reason is simple. Japan is one of the closest ally of the United States, and also Japan's one of the major. Japan is one of the major U.S. trade partner. So some trade uneasiness, conflict experienced actually in the past, and I tell you why by the way, my background is a dentistry. I became a dentist because I followed my mom. My mom is a dentist and still practicing. But I changed the course suddenly, and in 1988, when I graduated and I got a license of a dentist, somehow I talked with my father. My father was a Diet member and working on trade issues seriously. And in 1988, what is the major trouble of Japan? And my father told me, oh, everything is okay. Economic is good. Politics is stable. But relation with the United States, trade of conflict is a major trouble because Japan is not only the trade partner, but a major ally of the United States. And without it, Japan cannot survive it. That's serious. So I told my father, oh, let me go to the United States to study. And he said, yes. That's my career started. So U.S. trade conflict is very familiar to me. And later, my father served METI, at the time MITI, Minister of Industry of International Trade. And the counterpart was Ambassador Carla Hills. She happened to be CSIS after I joined. So it's a very small world. But you know, the trade conflict always there, potentially. But the reason is simply, you know, the economic theory, maybe trade is good for anybody. But in the real world, there's some losers in trade. So the very big challenge for the United States and Japan is how to adjust it. And now we are tackling on it. So it's not neglected. It's really needed to talk about something very important things. And what is the important one? That's stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And the Abe administration is clearly showing his own involvement in the Indo-Pacific. And the very good timing. Recently, the Japanese foreign minister published a blue book for the diplomacy. And that's more clearly stated the Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to introduce, because its English version is not coming yet. So I just briefly try to introduce based on the Japanese version. I think according to, it's a part of this, like this. It's a free and open Indo-Pacific area. So it says, maritime order in the Indo-Pacific area is facing a various threat. Japan promotes a FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, to remove threats, to maintain a strengthen free and open maritime order based on the rule of law, and to bring international public goods in the region by assisting high-quality infrastructure based on international standard. And the actual policy described 3. 1 is a promotion of a freedom navigation and the rule of law. And the second, economic prosperity through connectivity by high-quality infrastructure. And third one is assistance to maritime law enforcement capability and the HADR and the non-proliferation. As you may realize, that is a kind of a countermeasure to the OBOR of China. But Abe is not against OBOR. They seriously try to find the maintain the public goods in the region. I think that's basic idea. That's easy to explain. So why? Why is the very important part? Because Japan realized no alternative for the US as an allied partner. If US decided to leave a region, what Japan can do is very limited. So, and also, why Japan is not so frustrated is sometimes, described as an isolated partner of the United States over the North Korea. The reality is actually that what Japan can do directly to the North Korea is very limited. And what Japan cannot see in the negotiation between the US and the North Korea is 2 extremes. One extreme is, of course, war or conflict, military conflict. But Japan is afraid of the other extreme. That's too much concession by the US to the North Korea. Accept the North Korea as a nuclear state and starting the reduction of a nuclear arsenal. That's kind of a bad scenario. But even such a scenario realized, I think no alternative for Japan to take. So what Japan is trying to do is best to maintain tie with the United States and try to save international liberal order in the region. That's probably that you can find several things recently Abe administration did that. Very interesting case. Maybe you never realized this. I'd like to introduce. Sasakawa Peace Foundation, which I belong to, it has been working on several things, like the promotion of a military officers exchange between Japan and the PLA. And recently, actively, Japan and the military of Vietnamese military. And also promoting Asian Pacific nations, the stability and the prosperity. I think, and in that context, very interesting event in the Sasakawa Peace Foundation recently. We hosted Prime Minister of Republic of Malta in Europe, Malta. You know, Malta is famous for the end of Cold War to the talk, Malta. Why? Why Malta? Malta is an island nation and maritime nation and part of EU. So actually, the Prime Minister Abe visited Malta last year. And this time, Prime Minister of the Malta, Mr. Muscat, actually met Abe. And very interesting things is the both identified and confirmed the cooperation for the Japan, EU, EPA. That's the de facto FTA, freedom FTA. free trade agreement. And also, actually, Japan, and Prime Minister Abe stated that he had prayed for the soul of war debt of Japanese Imperial Navy in World War I. So showing how Japan tried to be the part of international community, not our own interest, but saving public goods. And also, actually, the stated confirmed the very important initiative with Malta and Japan to the international public goods and international order in the maritime area. That's kind of Japan is trying to do, even with Malta. And also another initiative that's actually in the Iwaki City of Fukushima, Prime Minister Abe held the summit with Pacific Island nations. That was May, and that was very amazing. The confirming a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy with participants, and it confirmed, all leaders confirmed the promotion and the establishment of the rule of law and the freedom of navigation, pursuit of economic prosperity through strengthening and in the connectivity, and the commitment to peace and stability, such as cooperation in the field of maritime safety and disaster risk reduction. Look at this. That's a very clearly the consistent strategic thinking in every the move of Japanese government. I'm not a supporter of, by the way, the government. I never belonged to government, and actually, politically, I'm not so close to the Prime Minister Abe's position. But I was, by the way, the advisor to the former Noda administration's the cabinet. So, but I'm like-minded Japanese people supported Prime Minister Abe's strategy, and should be continued in next administration, whichever LDP or opposition, because that makes sense. And that more makes sense because of Trump's America. We understand the frustration of people who are not so well doing, I think, the life of American. Some people are getting very rich and nice, but some are not. And the for leader really need to take care of these people. And sometimes, very effective to say, oh, enemy is not ours, but outside, foreign partner, or maybe trade partner. Well, reality is not so much, but perception is also another reality. So what Japan did, 80s and 90s, I think we didn't retaliate or revert to the U.S. the anxiety over the Japan's the market closeness and the trade imbalance. Instead, we've tried to find a way to save both. Japanese American people are comfortable, but at the same time trying to save a framework of free trade, and also alliance systems. The important one is at that time alliance was really, really crucial because of the Cold War, but now more crucial because of China. So I think that's probably what the people are trying to do that, and I hope the Motegi Lighthizer talk will create such kind of framework. So-called FFR. Do you know FFR means? Trade talk, fair and free and reciprocal. So FFR sounds like a SSI. I don't know how many people remember what SSI means. Strategic structural impediment, right? That was the very old days that Japan and US has working on, and we got over. And somehow Japan ended up with more investment in United States, and less anxiety. So why not future? And luckily, Mr. Lighthizer is a person who has done with Japan in Reagan administration. I think that's very important. And so one thing, I don't know. Today the talk is ongoing. I have no idea what's the result. But good thing is the bilateral economic talk continues, and that's good sign. Somehow Japan really has a common interest with the United States to deal with sometimes China's ignoring international rule, or somehow the investment, forcing investment with some information in China. This kind of things is shared with not only US, but Japan or European country and other Asian nations. So hope the trade talk may create some ground for the more common ground for the promoting international liberal order. That's I really hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabe. Ken?
We've heard some very interesting insights regarding Japan, but it seems to me, in that our topic is Japan, America's neglected ally, the heart of the matter, and certainly the part where I think I'd be most able to speak, would be the American side of that equation, and then the general nature of the problem that we're confronting today in U.S.-Japan relations and in Northeast Asia. I think it's important to start with that because we often lose the sight of the forest that we're in by looking in so much detail at the trees. The world that Dulles made in 1952, well, the peace conference, September of 1951, the U.S. and Japan were alone in the Pacific. China was under an embargo. Korea was in the midst of a war. Southeast Asia was colonized. They were alone. And the issue was bilateral. The issue today of U.S.-Japan relations, it seems to me, and this is put very starkly by the recent summit in Singapore and developments relating to the Korean Peninsula, is the U.S. and Japan are not alone in the Pacific. And the structural competition within the Pacific, as well as across the continent of Eurasia, is deepening. Of course, China is rising. That's part of it. Korea, of course, has its own interests and is quite assertive, as we know, here in Washington and elsewhere. The various Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN and so on, the Russians are in the equation, although I would say marginal. But the competition within Northeast Asia, both in the region and here in Washington, is intensifying, and also the interests in certain ways are diverging. We can see this clearly, I think, with respect to the North Korean missile issue, which directly challenges Japan, but confronts Korea in a somewhat different form. The most immediate, of course, for Korea, the tangents along the DMZ. For Japan, the missiles and the nuclear capability. And then in the future, as that rises, those challenges for the United States. So there's significantly divergent interests. So I think the title of this particular session, Bruce, has been very apt in selecting it because the interests are diverging. And I think it's difficult, and then the United States has to choose among those various competitors in the world and in Washington. Of course, it has a point of departure, the alliance itself, with the United States and also with the Republic of Korea. But if one's orientation is deal-making, the temptation to choose among a number of perspectives that basically are rivals, increasingly rivals of one another, and each of whom has something to offer, is tempting. Looking at, if the question, to address the question more direct, I do think the structural problem is serious. It could be, we could be moving, we can see the shadows of offshore balancing, where the United States simply picks and chooses among the options that it has and looks at the most attractive short-run prospect. That, in a certain sense, could be the art of the deal. That said, of course, as I say, we do have a context of an alliance. We have a good personal relationship between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. We have, I think, and I've been looking at this for 30 years, I think in Tokyo now, one of the most sensitive ambassadors to the overall lay of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and certainly on the economic side. He's not a specialist really on security, but he has a good DCM, Ambassador Haggerty and DCM Joe Young at the working level. And as I say, I don't say that certainly for people know from any partisan point of view, but I just think knowing a number of those people at that working level, we have some good people who are involved. I think we have a very good ambassador in India, Ken Juster, as well. And so some of the bases at the working level for both a bilateral relationship that doesn't neglect Japan and also an Indo-Pacific strategy, as Nabe-san was suggesting, I think that's an important part of the broader U.S. Commitment and interest right now. The basis of that is there. But the problems, to my mind, and being a student at Reischauer, I guess I reflexively look at the broken dialogue and at communication problems and at the structural difficulties of appointments and people talking past each other and not having an assistant secretary of state who's in place, and still having several ambassadors who haven't been named. And then just having so it's not the problem right down there at the ambassadorial level. I think it's further up the line, and it's coming amidst a situation where there's a structural challenge to the relationship in this deepening competition among various nations for Washington's favor. So, and we can see some of this even in the trade negotiations that are going on right now. The U.S., the Trump administration is reflexively pushing for an FTA, and I can see the political reasons for that. That said, there are so many win-win possibilities in the U.S.-Japan economic relationship right now that is simply talking past. And some of them, I think, are very constructively being developed by, again, more at the working level. For example, the cooperation between JBIC and OPEC with regard to U.S. LNG exports to third countries. A lot of the big issues where the U.S. and Japan can cooperate are not bilateral, but they're the U.S., Japan in the region. And, there's some constructive ideas that are being put out there. But in the trade talks, it's a matter of, okay, when are we going to sign a free trade agreement? And people who've seen this, and, I've been a supporter of a free trade agreement. Ambassador Mansfield was a supporter in the late 1980s. And when I was in U.S. Embassy Tokyo, this issue very often came up. And people who know the issue, I think, know rather well that a free trade agreement, it does have an abstract attractiveness, just like Indo-Pacific does. It sounds good. The question is, where are the details, and who's going to fill in the blanks? And do you have the people who will do that, or do you have the conceptualization to do that? And it naturally brings up agriculture is one thing it'll bring up. The other thing is autos. And if it's autos, does the U.S. side of the equation really have a serious interest in a solution? So there's these kind of structural problems in the nature of a free trade agreement that make it, I think, if one is trying to get a win-win out of this, rather than just talking points for the election, something like the the financial investment bank or financial bank cooperation, like with JBIC and that sort of thing, or working level defense cooperation. A lot of that, of course, is going on, as many people here know. We've had, I think, on the positive side with Secretary Mattis and the Defense Department, again, a very constructive relationship over the last few years on security. So, to summarize, not neglected in some key areas, but a broken dialogue or a dialogue of the deaf in a range of important areas. And more importantly than that, a deepening competition structurally across the Pacific that makes it attractive to play everybody against each other and just to get the best deal. But in the end, that does violence to a fundamental underlying structure of the relationship that, ever since the World War II has preserved stability in the Pacific.
Great. Thank you very much. Sheila?
Thank you, and thank you, Bruce, for inviting me today. Nabe-san discussed Japan and Professor Calder, the United States, so I'm not sure what I should do. So I want to talk about the U.S.-Japan relationship and its history. We are a little breathless here in Washington these days about what happens one day and then the next day, and I think it's worthwhile in forums like this to take a little bit of a step back and think about the relationship over time. We are in a moment, and I agree with both previous speakers, in the region where the security challenges for the United States and Japan, primarily in the Asia-Pacific, but not exclusively, are real and they're growing. So this is an alliance partnership that is vital to both countries, in my view. We've watched this over the last year and a half now with North Korea. I think a lot of people know that Japan is worried, not only about the missiles, but also about the weapons of mass destruction. But I think they don't appreciate as much what Prime Minister Abe has been doing, how Japan has responded. We're used to seeing this in terms of the U.S. ROK Japan response to the Korean Peninsula tensions. But of course, remember early last year, South Korea was getting ready for an election in May. So in fact, President Trump and Prime Minister Abe had an opportunity there to forge a much closer dialogue on the Korean Peninsula than they'd had in the past. Normally, we would turn to Seoul, right? The U.S. policymakers would turn to Seoul when tensions rose. But of course, Seoul wasn't in a position to begin that conversation when the North Koreans were intensifying their missile strikes, or their missile launches, not strikes, sorry, launches, in the direction of Japan. So Abe and Trump have managed to focus in on this part of the threat perception, I think, in a way that previous presidents and prime ministers have not. President Trump stood in Mar-a-Lago. You'll remember they were there first for the golf game. The North Koreans used that opportunity to launch multiple missiles in Japan's direction, and it was the first opportunity for President Trump to actually make a statement about the alliance and U.S. support for Japanese defenses. And of course, he came out and said, we're behind Japan 100%. That, again, was the most emphatic statement at the highest level of the U.S. government in terms of the strength of the alliance in deterring aggression against North Korea. It was an opportunity created by the North Koreans, right? But it was a statement, once again, despite the campaign rhetoric of the previous year, despite some of the worries that were in Tokyo, it was another moment for the alliance to make sure that we were on common ground. Less visible was the U.S.-Japan military exercises and signaling that was going on, the push forward to trilateralize in some way our demonstration of our capabilities in Northeast Asia. So as you watched last year unfold and the North Korean missile launches increase, Japanese and American military were demonstrating their capacity to work together, but they were also synchronizing with South Korea to basically convey to Pyongyang that don't take these two alliances as separate. If it came to a military conflict, we would both be ready to respond. And that was a new phase as well. Granted, I think we didn't see South Korean military on Japanese soil, nor did we see Japanese militaries exercising on South Korean soil, but we did see a synchronization of both the U.S. command and in South Korea and Japan with their allies that was unprecedented, I think, in terms of trying to demonstrate how committed both alliances were to handling any kind of use of force by the North. So I think it's important also to look at the diplomatic side. Prime Minister Abe was peripatetic last year. He was at the G20 meeting talking about North Korea. He was talking about North Korea in his meetings with Xi Jinping, with Vladimir Putin. He was making sure to marshal our European allies. He was very interested in getting this, what's called the sending countries, the UN participants who had gone and fought in the Korean War, the sending countries like Canada, right? France, other participants in that UN framework that now continues to govern peace on the peninsula, to make sure that those partners were also aware of their roles and supportive should anything happen. So again, Japan is not just important because it's physically in Northeast Asia. Both the Japanese military and the political diplomatic support last year for a very concerted global response to the threat from North Korea, I think was unusual, and it was quiet, not often appreciated here in the United States. So on the North Korea issue, I'm actually feeling reasonably strong, reasonably positive. I do take Kent's point that, now that we're in the negotiation phase, now that we're post-Singapore summit, there are some tender spots, and we've watched those in the past. We've tried to negotiate with Pyongyang, both in the 90s and again in the six-party talks in the 2000s, right? So we have to be alert to the fact that, again, as Kent pointed out, we may have different priorities in terms of how we perceive the specific threat from North Korea. And we want to make sure, for example, the United States doesn't get too far out ahead on any particular issue and ignore Japanese sensitivities, especially to that missile threat, but also to the broader weapons of mass destruction that the North Koreans possess. So again, synchronization during negotiations is just as important as lining up our troops to deter during moments of tension, and I think it's wise for us to be alert to that. The second challenge, of course, is this more amorphous challenge and perhaps less militarily threatening in the day-to-day consciousness of all of us. But that's, of course, this geostrategic shift being led by the rise of China in the region. I wrote a book about this in terms of Japanese reactions to it. Japan has felt the pressures from a rising China in large part because they're more proximate. They're right next door. So the Chinese military pressures in the East China Sea have been real, and the self-defense forces are operating at a higher tempo today and have been for some time now because of that rising military capability and presence of the Chinese maritime forces in particular. It's not the same kind of threat as North Korea, though. It's not a direct existential threat to Japanese safety, but it does shift Japanese perceptions of their own strategic needs. It does worry a lot of people, Prime Minister Abe, of course, but others in Japan, because the Chinese have been somewhat hesitant on the diplomatic side. They're in a normal, back to normal kind of day-to-day, government-to-government discussions, but what we're hoping by the end of this year is that Prime Minister Abe, in fact, could pay a visit to China, that there could be, again, a restoration of that high-level symmetry that's so important in that relationship. I don't know that there's a decision yet, but I'm hoping that that comes to fruition because it's a very important part of stabilizing the region, but it's also critical to Japanese security. But the larger picture here for the United States and Japan is what kind of Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, what kind of region are we prepared to help support? It's not just all about bilaterals, and I don't say that as bilateral relationships are not important. They are fundamentally important, and I think all three of us have described how. But the region in this moment of critical change, right, does need some frameworks for collective understanding of what are the rules of the road. And we've watched this debate over the maritime sphere emerge, and there is some challenge here. China doesn't feel like it needs to acknowledge some of the existing rules of the road. And like most rising powers, it is challenging us to be clear and fair and cooperative in how we establish those rules and norms. So engaging the Chinese on this conversation is important. Nonetheless, I think the behavior that we're witnessing in the South China Sea has fundamental consequences for how the rest of Asia perceives not only Japan, but the United States, and how those rules are going to be written. So we have a question here about whether or not coercion, be it economic or military, is going to become the norm in Asia. And again, it's very anticipatory. We haven't seen behavior yet that says this is what's going to happen. But we see signposts here that I think we're going to have to be quite alert to and quite responsive to if we're going to continue to see an Asia-Pacific that is stable and prosperous and that people can anticipate it's going to be stable and prosperous. Let me say a little bit, just to follow on Kent's comments here about American politics. I over the last year and a half or so with our new administration, there's been a lot of demand for, well, what is the alliance like in the Trumpian world? And, so I find myself writing essays about the Trumpian world. But I think I've decided that it's time for us, again, to take a little bit of a longer view here on, we don't know yet what kind of recalibration is ongoing now in the United States in terms of how the American people feel about the U.S. role in the world. And one of the things I'm grateful for this panel and for Bruce to bring us back to this point is what it should be. And I obviously feel strongly that the United States has a very important role to play in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. And our alliances are the foundation of that role. And our partners across the region should be our focus of attention. But we've had this debate in the United States before. And especially for our younger participants, I want to remind you, we've had this conversation more than once. This is not new to American politics. We've talked about burden sharing with our allies since the 1960s, and Mike Mansfield, then senator, said, Europeans pay up, right? There was a debate in our Congress about amending our support for NATO to be based on how much the Europeans paid, right? So these are consistent and continuous conversations that we ought to be having with our allies on alliance equities. And I think we ought to make sure that the American people support these alliances. And so they're important in that sense. And I think this is where the U.S.-Japan alliance actually looks like one of our stronger relationships at the moment, because I think a lot of some of these indicators are shifting in a direction that the American people should feel more confident about. We've also, and I think both of our speakers have noted here, we've also had our economic reassessments about how we participate in the global economy, whether it's trade deals with Japan or the Plaza Agreement in 1985, whether you go back to the 70s and think about the United States and the Smithsonian Agreement, where we were not happy about the dollar, right, being pegged to gold. We've had multiple times in which we have reassessed our global role in managing and in underpinning the global economic order. I think we continue to have a role to play. I think if we abandon that role, we will not be, in the end, better off for it economically, but I will leave that debate to our economists. But neither of these are new. What I think is new is that we have this confluence of rising threat and in this geostrategic shift ongoing in Asia, while we are beginning to have a fairly fundamental debate in the United States about some of these equities. And if you look at the past, whether it's Eisenhower in the 50s or it's that Nixon Guam doctrine at late 60s into the 1970s and the Carter, right, the Carter decision or argument to pull out troops from the Korean Peninsula, and then even to the end of the Cold War, where we were all talking about reaping the peace dividend, right? Those were periods of relative minor threat assessment. In other words, we all thought that the region was getting better or that our stake was less necessary. It was rare that we have this debate at the same time where we are cognizant, and our national security strategy and national defense strategy make this clear. We're cognizant that this is a period of intensifying major power competition. So that's where I think it's important for the alliance, whether it's this alliance or the US-ROK alliance or NATO, right? We are seeing increasing indications of strategic competition, and yet we are undercutting or reassessing the value of our alliances. And that's, I think, where people like us start to get a little worried. I don't worry about the reassessment by the American people of what our interests are or how we ought to recalibrate equities. I do worry that we will do it in a way that suggests that we don't care about the strategic competition in the Asia-Pacific. And that, for me, would be a grave mistake. And it would also deeply worry our ally in Japan. Because as both speakers have said, Japan doesn't have other alternatives. And that is not a pressure point that we should be pushing on. It is a recognition of the consequences of getting this wrong, right, for Japan, right? So again, I just wanted to pull in the excellent points that my speakers have made here in terms of we have some short-term decisions to make, but I think we do have a pretty critical moment for making sure that we don't neglect Japan, that we don't underestimate the fundamental importance of this relationship in both respects. So thank you, Bruce.
Right, well, 3 great presentations. Before I throw the floor open to questions, let me paint admittedly a dark picture, and it may just be the grumpy jet lag talking, and it risks going to focusing too much on the trees and not the forest, as it can counseled against, and it may ignore the positive long-term trends that Sheila talked of. But the U.S. pulled out of TPP, which Japan had put political capital into, including the U.S. We're very clearly pushing back against a bilateral FTA with Japan. Abe had developed the best relationship of any leader with Trump. And then it seems there could be questions in Japan of, but what did it get us? There was no preferential treatment on tariffs, and kind of Japan, like many, were surprised by a change in policy on North Korea. So is it wow, we thought we were shoulder to shoulder walking down a path, and then all of a sudden Japan's walking down that path alone? There's a lot of talk, not just about Japan, but it includes Japan, about ungrateful allies, not paying enough. And then even when many of us have pointed out that Japan and South Korea and others do pay a large share of reimbursing the costs of U.S. forces overseas, and of course it's in our own interest to have forces overseas, that Japan has paid a lot, and that Abe has done a lot. Sheila was referring, I think, to a long list of security reforms and implementation of policy that the U.S. has long been calling for, and Abe has done a lot of those on his watch. I think overall of the total U.S. Pacific military construction budget of $39 billion, Japan and South Korea are paying $32 billion of it, including not only U.S. facilities in South Korea, Japan, and Okinawa, but even Japan paying for facilities in Guam, clearly not their own territory. But still, even when that's pointed out, there's a lot of, yeah, but it's still not enough. Continuing on my litany. North Korea policy. Japan, like many of us, surprised by the shift from seemingly brink of war to negotiations. Abe talked about concern about maybe too many concessions. But also in that there's sort of a context of over there. We've seen Senator Graham, President Trump, kind of referring to the region over there, as very distant and distinct. And that's both in a concept of war, of like, well, yeah, there'd be a war, but it would be over there. It's like, well, we have all these troops as well as U.S. civilian citizens over there, and of course, we are committed by treaty as well as doing the right thing to protect our allies. But even in the sense of if we kind of have a magical solution to the nuclear problem, and as nations are looking to help rebuild North Korea, it'd be like, well, yeah, Japan and South Korea would pay for it. So kind of admittedly overly negative. Is that like, well, Bruce, didn't you listen to our presentations? That's overly negative. Reread your notes. But if it isn't overly negative, it's the where does Japan go? It can't seem to go it alone for all the constraints that are on its security, self-imposed and imposed by others. It's in a bad neighborhood. It's facing a rising China. Two dragons can't occupy the same mountain at once. So whither Japan? Are there things that is it now feeling we do have to do things differently? We can't rely on the U.S. like we could, or is it, oh, Bruce, this is a tempest in a teapot, and you need to look at the longer trends? So I'll just throw it open to anyone.
I guess the first thing I would say, I think to some degree you're going to get hedging to the extent that the U.S. commitment isn't clear or what it is that the U.S. doesn't reflect Japanese interests. It may take time, and it'll be quiet, but there's some degree of hedging. I think we can see a little bit of this in the evolution in the last 2 years or so. I'd be interested in how Sheila sees that of the Japan-China relationship. Some of this isn't the foreign ministry; it's METI or some of the other ministries. But you know, starting a couple of years ago, Belt and Road got some prominence in the trade white paper. A lot of companies, of course, would like to participate in Belt and Road. Now, Li Keqiang has come to Tokyo, and Prime Minister Abe is going to Beijing, and there's talk of, President Xi coming back to Japan. That's all just sort of diplomatic, and it reflects the 40th anniversary of the anti-hegemony treaty. But, you know, I think there is a certain element of hedging that would almost inevitably be the case, not only with respect to China, but diversifying foreign policy. What Nabe-san said about Malta is very interesting, a broader Japanese strategic relationship that, of course, did exist during World War I, that was much more global, that involved Europe. And, you know, some of the people who've been sent, Takamizawa-san in Geneva and representation at NATO. Japan certainly is globalizing some of its interests in a hedging sort of way. It would be interesting to me to see what will happen. I don't think it'll be overt, but it must be a difficult situation for Japan with respect to Iran, in that the administration feels so strongly about that, but China says that they're not going to respect the embargo on oil. They're not going to increase their imports, but they're not going to cut them back. And of course, Japan has had a relationship with Iran that goes back 100 years that's been relatively good historically. So I don't think we'll see things that will directly contradict core U.S. interests. I would not think that, for example, that hedging on the Iran question, we'll see much of that. But we saw it on China, we'll see it. Well, in India, what can India do? Of course, that's, the two countries can agree on, the U.S. and Japan can agree. That one may gain some momentum, but we'll see different kinds of hedging, that's my sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think the hedging is going to be soft and gentle hedging. I don't think it's abrupt. It's not going to be as if it's not the U.S., therefore there's an alliance with China. I don't think we're going to see that. But I think what you can see clearly is on the trade side, and again, I say this in praise, not in criticism, but on the trade side, even though Prime Minister Abe continues to try to persuade President Trump of the benefits of a regional framework for thinking about free trade. He did it in the golf cart at Mar-a-Lago early on about TPP. He continues to do it now. I don't know if you were listening at the joint statement the last time he came to visit. It wasn't the last time, it was the second to last time. But the second summit when Abe and Trump basically talked about North Korea, and then they talked about trade. And what you heard from Prime Minister Abe was the free, open, reciprocal Indo-Pacific. And the president said, I like bilaterals better, but if you show me this is a good thing, I'm willing to listen. So I think Abe is still working the problem. He may not be using TPP language. He may not think that the CPTPP is going to be the place where this happens for this administration, but he's using the Indo-Pacific concept in a different way to say, let's set the table on the Indo-Pacific now. And so that may be indicative of where we see the tension as we watch the Lighthizer talks or other things evolving. But Japan does want to see a regional frame, right, for the trade relationship between the United States and Japan, because it doesn't make sense, I think, otherwise, to think about it that way. They don't buy in, and I think, Deputy Prime Minister Aso has been very frank and very blunt and very in the public about this, that they don't see a free trade agreement as fixing the deficit problem. So they don't see it as the right instrument to address the deficit, and which is what the Trump administration wants to address the deficit. So there's a disconnect there on, okay, that may be the problem, but this instrument is not going to do it for us. And that's the way Deputy Prime Minister also has consistently said, responded to this conversation by Ambassador Haggerty and others about the problem of the deficit. Again, we've got a lot of problem solving on that side of the relationship, but on the larger question, I think largely this Prime Minister Abe, has sought to persuade and inform and explain, and so it's less hedging than taking the time to lay out the downsides of certain kinds of behaviors, be they economic or the North Korea, frankly, for that matter, right? And in public, again, Japan, Prime Minister Abe's Japan has been very supportive of the maximum pressure strategy on the sanctions, on other things. So you don't see the open discord that you see, for example, at the NATO meetings, or you see with Angela Merkel, or you see even sometimes with Moon Jae-in, right, early on. So that's a stylistic difference, but I think it's an important one, that I think Japan will be the behind-the-scenes advisory kind of ally, not the taking it on head-on. I have one exception, and that is if we move forward with Section 232 tariffs on autos. There, Japan's interests are just too deeply. And again, I don't know if the panelists agree with me here. Right. Whether it's Mr. Abe or somebody else, Japan will retaliate. Japan will have to retaliate. So its own economic interests, right, industrial interests will be at stake. And so you won't be able, that won't be the pattern of behavior, I think, that we'll see, that we've seen to date. On the larger question of where do they go, I don't see Japan-China as an alternative to the U.S.-Japan alliance. I just don't see it. We'd have to be in a very, very different world. We may be in that world 10 years from now, and we may all come back, and it may be different, but not in the foreseeable future. I think the strategic competition between Japan and China is real. I think the long-term concern about China's military power is very real in Tokyo. And I think that's where the U.S. and Japan may have some differences in emphasis. We may not be as concerned at times as the Japanese will be on Chinese military power. But that's partly explained by they live right next door, and they will be affected. No matter what the Chinese decide to do, they will be affected by that military power. On the global network of production, though, you could see the Chinese invite the Japanese into a different conversation about trade in the region. And again, this is my worry, right, about the auto tariffs, right, in terms of how it affects the political side of the U.S.-Japan relationship. Beijing has the same set of interests that Mr. Abe articulates, right? And so you could see, and I'm not saying we should be afraid of this conversation with the Chinese, but I could see that that would be an interesting and intriguing place for Xi Jinping to try to draw Mr. Abe into conversation. Again, should the United States move forward on the auto tariffs. So you could see policy steps that see Japan and China aligned on specific economic issues like that, but I don't see them in a strategic sense, in our old-fashioned sense of, billiard ball kind of shifting of alliances. I don't see that.
I think I pretty much agree with the Sheila's talk, especially the Japan's interest to remove 232, right? That's serious because automakers, automobiles export is a very serious one. So, but also I say that Japan don't have a real alternative to the alliance with the United States. That's very true. Any administration, but. Remember that in 1950, that if the Japanese politics watcher says 1950 was a very interesting moment. That's Liberal Democratic Party was created. Why? I think at that time Japan Socialist Party was very strong and somehow attractive alternative, and 1950 was a year Japan had the San Francisco peace treaty. And at that time, two divisions in the Japanese the public opinion. One is a socialist. I think we should have a peace treaty not only with US and Europe, but Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. And such opinion was popular at that time. But wisely, Japanese public chose conservative party. Party really needed to have a strong power. So several conservative party merged as a liberal democratic party. So, of course, no alternative for Japan so far. But don't underestimate some party dynamics, because I think Prime Minister Abe is popular somehow and very strong. So, and LDP is somehow strong. But no guarantee. LDP has been very strong because of Japan's economic prosperity and very good very short-term and continuous economic development without creating a huge income gap. That was a very good political resources. But current Japan is not, unfortunately. Many financial burden in the future already for the social security cost, medical cost, and also the aging. So I don't think Japan has a very good future rosy scenario. So that's why Japan probably don't have many alternative, like okay, the wild scenario, like we need a plan B and create our own striking capability and the nuclear, and maybe the not so easy to have an alliance. Maybe try to be the more non-alignment and closely leaning toward Russia and China. That's very bad scenario, but theoretically we could think of this. I don't think that is the happy scenario for Japan, and Japanese public are pragmatic enough so far. But economic, the prosperity is gone, and very people are frustrating with. Some people may choose a very bad leader. That's the we could think of.
Great, thank you. All right, so we'll throw open the floor for questions. I think we have a microphone, so if you could wait till the microphone gets to you and say your name and affiliation, and then if you could keep your questions short. Right here, sir.
Thank you very much for great conversations. I'm Takahiro Motegi, BCM fellow at CSS Japan. I'm Nabe-san's kohai. My question goes to Shira-san and Nabe-san. Question to, Shira-san is that, related to the contradiction between U.S. and China. Japan. And so, except 232, don't you think kind of a view between? Nabe-san said that Prime Minister Abe is not against, one belt, one road, but still, President Trump mentioned that he, in Twitter criticized it on Belt and Road or something like that. But do you think one belt, one road will become a kind of contradiction between U.S. and Japan? And in my understanding, China's understanding, Prime Minister Abe also confirmed that Japanese government or Prime Minister Abe, affirmed that Japan would join, Belt and Road. And this is question to Shira-san. And the question to Nabe-san is, there used to be a report that Prime Minister Abe had an intention to meet with, Kim Jong-un. I haven't seen any report since, these few months. Is there any, comment on that? Have you ever seen any kind of report about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
So do you want me to take I'll take the first question. Thank you for that. I think the Japanese approach to OBOR is in some ways, or at least the government approach, I should say, has been to have it on the table in the conversation. So when Lee visited for the trilateral, visited to Japan, that was on the table. I think that Japan and China have agreed to search for a possible project that maybe they can cooperate on. I think what Tokyo's intentions there are not to endorse OBOR, right, but to find a place where they can raise the standards, right, and engage China in a discussion about a high standard global norm kind of approach to infrastructure, right, be it energy, be it other places, right. So I think there's a desire to see if they can find that spot. And maybe it's emblematic in a project where that would be workable. I don't know, and I think if we do have a summit meeting, we'll find out whether they've managed to do that or not. But I think it's a little bit like the AAIB conversation, right? Which is China is putting its capital at the service of a multilateral bank, right? So let's make that a global standard multilateral. Let's make that a workable solution. And by that, the governance structure has to be at the same, it has to match global standards. If it's just a tool of Chinese hegemony, we're not interested, right? And I think, as you may know, the Ministry of Finance in Japan was a little bit more forward-leaning because they had colleagues, Chinese colleagues, right? They had conversations in the past. They had some sense that there was a constructive conversation that might be able to happen. Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
I don't think Moss.
not so happy. But it depends on who you talk to, I think. I think there's, maybe I shouldn't say it's a bureaucratic interest, but there were some who thought there was some room there to move the needle on Chinese performance. But I think on OBOR it's a little easier because the projects are smaller. Strategically, though, just to take that back, I don't think there's a Japanese endorsement of Chinese ambitions for OBOR. But I think there could be some sort of tinkering in terms of finding a place. The flip side of that on the U.S.-Japan side is, and I think Kent referred to this, the JBEC-OPEC conversation is also about U.S.-Japanese coordination and cooperation in projects, infrastructure projects in the region. Now, they'll be very different, right? They'll of necessity be very different. But I think we all recognize the need for infrastructure development, and I think what we want to do is shape the way in which that happens, and I think that's where you'll see it. I don't think at this point we should see that, though, as a big endorsement of OBOR.
If I could just add, I'm doing some work on exactly this point, and I think that the magnitudes is something we have to consider. You know, the Secretary Pompeo's proposal, $113 million, high-quality infrastructure, and, you know, Belt and Road is on the order of 900 billion. So the scale, the simple scale, I think, of a lot of what the Chinese are doing is something that certainly it draws some corporate interest. And I would say interbureaucratically, more than MOF, my impression is Minister Aso, of course, is very skeptical of China along these lines. But within METI, of course, they're closer to the business world. You know, there's more pragmatism about some sort of working cooperation, nothing formalized, but the simple scale of the projects, I think, suggests that there's an attractiveness.
Oh, yes. One correction, I said that the LDP was created in 1950. No, it's 1955, after 5 years of San Francisco Peace Treaty. And the San Francisco Peace Treaty was also, I think, the year of, at the same time, Japan-US Mutual Security Treaty. And the answer to the Prime Minister Abe's willingness to see the bilateral talk with North Korean counterpart, I think that's very kind of a hedge to the either case. But you know, remember when the Japanese leader had a direct talk with North Korean leader? That was Prime Minister Koizumi's visit to Pyongyang. And at that time, U.S. was President Bush Jr. And first Bush, very hard against the North Korea regime and tried to somehow, very critical to the framework agreement which was made by the Clinton administration. And at that time, the major player was Under Secretary of State, John Bolton. So at that time, North Korea was really, really pressed and feel uneasy and really need to talk with U.S. But U.S. don't want to talk without any clear nuclearization agreement or something, conditioned. And so North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-il, somehow decided to see Koizumi. Koizumi is so close to Bush, and also expecting some economic aid. So, and but Koizumi didn't see without condition. Condition is a clarification of an abductee issue. That is a starting point. North Korea first admitted their abductees, the abduction of the Japanese ordinary citizen. So, this time, of course, the first Trump administration's strong pressure over North Korea, but now showing some room. And we never know. Japanese don't know. So some kind of hedge is probably if things is going go on like a agreement of denuclearization is implemented, and the North Korean talk with the U.S. and the other is ongoing. Japan would face anyway. Japan need to talk, and the issue is Japan is expected to help economic development aid, and but Japanese ordinary the people's reaction is where's the abduction issue, and actually the Prime Minister Abe himself is a leader to make it clear for the abduction issue. So I think it's safe to say we are open for the open channel to talk about it, and that's clearly if things is going ahead. Ready to talk to such kind of things, but abduction issue must become first, and that's clearly Abe, Prime Minister Abe keep telling President Trump, and President Trump clearly understand, and he's a very amazingly brought such an issue with a talk with the Kim Jong-un. So I think that is the case so far. So, but we never know what's going on between the U.S. and North Korea. So it's safe hedge for the Abe to the open talk. And Abe is using some secret channel like Prime Minister Koizumi? I don't think so.
It did seem like there was more talk about it, an Abe-Kim summit earlier when, Kim was sort of the diplomatic debutante of the year, and everyone wanted to get on board the train of, well, if everyone else is meeting with him, I guess I'd better. Otherwise, Japan looks like they're left out. But North Korea was very dismissive of the abductee issue and said, it's been solved, move on. And then now as the U.S.-North Korea talks are, I think more publicly becoming clear that we're not getting anywhere, and North Korea released another grumpy-gram last night or this morning, sort of, no, 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 what don't you get about no? That Abe may feel like, well, okay, if the train is faltering, he doesn't need to put as much effort into getting a summit. Otherwise it looked like he was being left out. Right here.
Thank you for coming. This is really great conversation. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, member of Heritage Foundation. I'm a Japan native U.S. citizen. I've been here about 45 years, so I have limited information coming into me personally. What I want to talk about is the security treaty, as you mentioned, saved Japan, but that put Japan into back seat, not the front seat. Of course, U.S. is sitting in the driver's seat. But the trouble is, I feel that Japan was complacent being in the back seat. That really saddens me. It's a two-way street, and America did not urge Japan to come up here to the front seat, the passenger seat. And they didn't do that either. So it's a two-way street. But my question is, instead of concentrating on economics so much, Japan should been concentrating on the Security Treaty, Article 9, changing the Constitution to a little more, not aggressive, but assertive positions. But they didn't do that. It takes opportunity to do that. Now they have that opportunity, North Korea. So maybe they should concentrate on that. So that way, Japan can help America a little more, so to speak. So my question is, what do you think of that?
May I?
Yeah.
Actually, the Abe has done a lot in the context of the Japan would sit in the front seat. As for the defending Japanese territory, Japan is already. Looking back, like U.S.-Japan Security Cooperation, Defense Cooperation against the Soviet Union, I think as a clearly, especially naval cooperation in Japan was very secretly sitting in the front seat, seriously. So, but now try to be more. So I think a change of interpretation of Article 9 was a very safe way to change, and Abe did. And also Abe passed the security legislation. And that was clearly in the case of Japan's territorial defense, and also situation would affect Japan's the security gravely. Is a case for the Japan can exercise right of collective defense means can sit with a front seat with the United States. And other case, not. But probably it would take a time. And again, limitation is not legal one, like Article 9. But more, I think the budgetary and equipment and the training, and that's ongoing. Like, the Japan's self-defense forces is now developing a lot of amphibious capability with coordination with the U.S. military. So that's really the something. And but also sometimes the limitation of Japan, that's the patrolling South China Sea with the U.S. Navy, that's beyond the current ability. And so the Japan's approach is like other nation, very rationally and incrementally, but clearly changing a lot.
Just to follow on the South China Sea, Japan participated in the Somali piracy operations, obviously very far from home, from shores. Would operating in the South China Sea, if Japan is saying that it doesn't want to be involved, is that a lack of capabilities or a lack of wanting to be so confrontational openly with China?
You know what? I think a lack of the capability means because the Japanese self-defense forces, naval self-defense forces, and also the Coast Guard is too busy to defend our own East China Sea territory, seriously. Okay. So that makes sense because we are trying to very hard to defend our own territory in East Asia. I think the U.S. Navy can spend more time, more energy over the South China Sea. And also, I said that regular patrol is beyond the current capability, but occasionally, as you pointed out, I think issue-based self-defense forces is participating in the exercise and beyond our territory. So I think situation is gradually changing to the very positive way.
I was gonna add to what Nabe said, but also Nabe-san said, but also to get back to this question of Article 9. I've just finished a book manuscript that talks about a little bit about the Japanese decision-making on military force, right? Is Japan doing more? Is it doing less? And there's a lot of confusion in my mind, not in my mind, but there's a lot of confusion in the debate about Article 9. And so if you read Article 9, what it says, whether you like it or don't like it, but what it basically says is Japan won't use military force for coercion, right? It will no longer use force to settle international disputes. But the Japanese government has always interpreted Article 9 to allow for self-defense. Right. And if you go back to the Diet debates in the 50s, they're very frank. Does that mean nuclear weapons? Yes. Well, if necessary for our defense, we'll get them. Does it mean strike forces? Yes. If necessary for our self-defense, yes, we'll get them. What about preemptive strike? I mean, so you go to those early debates, and again, remember the self-defense forces were created in 1954. The early interpretation doesn't limit Japanese military capability. At that point, again, it was, as Ken said, it was just us and Japan. There was, in the abstract, there wasn't any major existential threat to Japan. But in the abstract, no Japanese leaders at the time were really willing to put a lid on Japanese capability for self-defense. And that's a big, elastic concept, right? So I think I am less convinced that Article 9 is the solution to the problem. The question is, when you say, what would it look like, for me, what would it look like to have Japan in the driver's seat? And I guess I'm just supporting Nabe-san's point of view that when it comes to Japanese defense capability, and the use of force against aggression, I think the SDF are in the driver's seat. They may not be able to do it depending on who the attacker is, right? And I think that's where things have changed. So the minute you start seeing the Chinese government send government forces to the Senkakus, right, you started to see this question of real concern about a military engagement with China. There's always been an existential question about the potential of Chinese military capability. But in terms of threat perception, I think you really see shifts around that 2010 defense plan, but it absolutely accelerated thereafter, right? And then, of course, there's the North Koreans. Belligerence has been a very specific threat to Japan. So I think you're going to see, remember, this year there'll be a new national defense plan and a new 5-year procurement plan, and we will see just how far out Japan goes. But I tend to agree it's less about being in the front or the back seat, but it's about really how fast and how far the government can pull the Japanese people, and how much money they're going to be able to spend quickly. But that would be my interpretation here. But it depends on how you define the front and the back seat, right? Is it capability driven? Is it in terms of their decision making, government decision making? I think there's a lot of factors in that analogy, and I think, at least in theory, it may not be Article 9. It may be the political and fiscal constraints that are operating inside Japan largely.
I guess I would just add that we shouldn't depreciate the major changes that have occurred just in the last 4 years or so in the operational side, and the synergies between the two countries, you know, and especially since the changes in the definition of collective self-defense. It seems to me that's important. Maybe Nabe-san is underestimating to some extent at least the capabilities that Japan now has under a collective self-defense. Whether it wants to exercise them is another question. Of course, in South Sudan, we saw, you know, an incident where it didn't seem to have gone terribly well, but Japan has one of the largest minesweeping forces in the world, for example. Now, why that can't be used in the Strait of Hormuz or in the South China Sea or in a whole range of places, potentially, given the changes that have been made under collective self-defense, I think, you know, there probably there's a significant range of things. And in terms of defense co-production and, you know, the guidance systems for our Tomahawk missiles and cruise missiles and so on, you know, in defense production, there's both very substantial interdependence that aids the defense of both countries. And I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, those synergies have increased quite a bit, to the extent that no doubt, Article 9 an important symbolic issue, but more on the substantive side, there have been some really important changes.
And on the minesweeping, there have been some multilateral exercises near the Strait of Hormuz, including South Korea. And that's a way of practicing kind of Korean theater of operations, you know, joint work or bilateral or multilateral work, but not practicing it close to the Korean Peninsula, which would be very controversial, but it's a way of getting Japan and the South Korean militaries working together, even if it's away from Korea, but for Korean operations.
Yep.
I know several of our panelists have follow-on commitments that I promised I'd get them out of here on time. So I think we're close to the end, or according to your watch, we are.
My watch is fast.
All right, we'll take one more question, but we'll keep it quick and I'll get them out of here. So, sir.
Ken Joseph, I teach at Chiba University. I just have a kind of a simple question. Particularly the older Japanese are extremely concerned that at the end of the day, this is nothing more than a well-organized return to the pre-war situation. And It all sounds very technical, but for those of us in Japan, particularly those of us who were born and raised there and grew up hearing all the stories, there's a deep, deep underlying fear that at the end of the day, it is simply a gradual return to that, and that one day we'll wake up and there'll be an announcement that American forces have been asked to leave. Congratulations on the independence of the country, and we're back to where we were before. So I'd just like some of your feelings on that. And the general feeling of the Japanese people is very strongly to protect the Constitution, because at the end of the day, everybody knows the day after the last American troops leave, Japan is back to where it was before. Sadly, the democratic situation has not developed to a point where it's able to stand by it. So that's what most Japanese think personally, but probably would never say. So I'd just like your thoughts on the another view of it, that this is simply returning back to where we were, and we're about 1930 or 31 right now.
All right. Well,
Let Abe go first. Japanese citizen.
right. That's right. Let me try first. I think go back to the pre-war situation is a very the unthinkable. The reason is simply the international situation is different. But at the same time, the Japan's Japanese deep-rooted the anti-war is not general anti-war. The former leadership who conducted so irresponsible war managing in World War II was deep-rooted. I think that is combined with some pacifism. So, that doesn't apply to the defense, I believe. And Article 9 is a kind of a manifest. We never go to the very big troubled war conducts. So, I think that is clearly the people share the memory of World War II, especially the war against Japan and war against the U.S. and war against China. That was terrible wars. So the situation is really different, but the most different situation is what? I think clearly the Japan has an alliance with the United States, and also somehow the democratic nation and shared with common values and the shared economic prosperity. And that's shared with China too. Not democratic things, but the economic prosperity is really shared with China. So I think some people easily say, "Oh, that the Japan is Abe is a ultra-nationalist and go back to." But that is a fantasy and fake news. Especially in the English world, I was amazed that when Abe came to, Abe is an outspoken nationalist. That was 3 days or 3 years or 4 years, 5 years ago. But I don't think now Abe is described such a way. So I think Abe is a foreign minister, defense minister, is coming from a liberal faction of LDP and a very reasonable, rational person. So, the image is sometimes easily utilized by especially the opposition to LDP or opposition to Abe in the media. But reality is not. And the Abe tend to be the pragmatic realist rather than ideological hawk. But again, I'm not defending Abe. That is because of Japan's economy and the politics is stable. Nippon Kaigi is, the kind of the people who love nostalgia of old one, and the frustrated current situation also too. And unfortunately, or fortunately, or maybe that their influence is very limited, and especially if Abe stepped down, who gonna carry Nippon Kaigi? I don't see any prominent politician in LDP would carry. So that's probably not so worried about it if current economic stability and continues. So wild card is like pre-war Japan again. So like the all troubled the economy and the trade block the trade, and that's really bad. But it's not Japan's responsibility, but it's up to the U.S. leader, I believe.
Can I just I know we're pressed for time, so I'll make my comments very brief. I just cannot buy into this idea that the U.S.-Japan alliance is the protector of Japanese democracy today. And again, that may be generational for me, or maybe as I'm an outside observer, I could just be wrong. But to tell you the truth, I think we have to empirically just test some of these big hypotheses a bit, right? If that were true, then we would have seen a much higher defense spending in Japan. In other words, the democratic process in Japan is not protected by the alliance, right? Nor, I think, does the alliance dictate the choices of the Japanese voters, right? There's a lot of times in the history in the last 70 years when the U.S. governments would have liked a very different outcome in policy. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other is, I think, the Nippon Kaigi conversation has gotten very heated lately, and I think it's largely because of the association with Abe, and also because Nippon Kaigi activities have become much more overt, whereas before they were very quiet and down in localities and local communities, and nobody sort of worried about their national presence. They've been given a little bit more opportunity to articulate their views in public under the current prime minister, and so I granted. But if 2/3 of the Diet members are Nippon Kaigi members, then you should have seen some very different conversations. If you really do tie a direct tie between Nippon Kaigi and the outcome of legislative process in Japan, we would have seen some very different legislative outcomes, I think, on things like the abdication of the emperor. There's all kinds of sensitive issues where Nippon Kaigi has views, right? And yet you don't see that reflected in the legislative voting behavior and things like that. I just think your concerns may be right about the pressures that may be on the Japanese politics. I think they're true of all of our democracies at the moment. You can look at Europe, you can look at us, you can look in Asia. All democracies, right, are subject to these kinds of pressures. And I think just putting it a little bit more in comparative and then looking at specific issues to see whether or not our fears are warranted is probably a wise course of action. Thank you.
All right, well, I think the sign of a good discussion is we've run out of time before we've run out of questions. So if you please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Hey, that was great.